last time we, in the context of this new narrative of the circle of existence, something that complements the physical picture of the world, so drawn in such great detail over the last few centuries, but which sees the universe as something running down, running towards its own destruction. With this picture of the universe complemented by another arc of ascent, which is building things up. Within this a view of this picture of existence, we can see the relativity of truths within it, because at any given time, we are present at some point on this circle. The circle represents the constant unfolding of consciousness. It's this process of the universe waking up from moment to moment. And we and every other being and everything else in the universe is somehow participating in this journey. And as we traverse the stages of this journey, the terrain, viewed from our perspective, shifts. And the truths that we hold to be fundamental may also shift between one stage of this journey and the next. And in a way, this is the cause of all the divisions that we see in the world. Not all the divisions we see in the world. Some of the divisions, many of the divisions we see in the world, let me correct myself, are a result of bad faith, are a result of people who don't have the truth in mind, who are simply on a quest for power, on a quest for things pertaining only to the material world. For those who are on the quest for reality, the fact of deep divisions between them is one of the great sicknesses that Baha'u'lláh diagnoses. The diversity of religion. People who all are attempting to get at reality and they can't agree on what reality is. It's this kind of division that the circle of existence, this circle of creation, gives us one way of understanding. How do these divisions arise, and how can they all be seen as valid in their own perspective? Then yesterday we sort of jumped inside this mystic journey, this arc of ascent from the human perspective, and tried to tease out how it's been described within the Baha'i writings. And of course, I was really just focusing on the Baha'i writings on this, although the literature of mystic journey is immense, and one can find so many themes common to the Baha'i writings within the spiritual traditions of the East and the West. But the focus and the time permitted us only to look at passages really from the Baha'i writings. This mystic journey of the individual is just a prelude to what we might think of as the completion of this mystic journey, which is individuals along the arc of ascent come together in associations, just as the material atoms of the physical world come together in associations at an earlier stage in the arc of ascent and release potentialities which were only there in potential. The free hydrogen atoms which had to collapse gravitationally to produce the first generation of stars, so that those atoms could then come together in association in the hearts of those stars, release the light which then bathes the universe. We can think of that as, and even before that, the coming together of quarks to form the first nuclei in the first seconds of the Big Bang. The whole story of creation from first to last is the story of things coming together in ever larger configurations, because somehow the physical substrate acts as a mirror for the reflection of these attributes of potentiality that we call divine attributes. And the human being, with all of its complexity and its potential for spiritual advancement, is only one atom, can be thought of as only one atom in a larger configuration of human beings coming together in gradually larger circles as human history advances, the family unit, the tribal unit, the nation state, and now in this turning point in human history, the world. And if the atoms of our physical being coming together release such potentialities of consciousness within us as individual human beings, what greater potentialities will be released when human beings come together to form this larger body, this organic whole of a world civilization that it is our mission to aid in the creation of. So in the stages between us as individuals to this highest degree of unity in the physical world, we might see ourselves first as more limited units, but then finally as an entire unit. And one of these most limited units that we see ourselves as, not most limited, but universal in its own scope, but our sense of religious identity throughout recorded history throughout the last 2,000 years has been, at one and the same time, the source of some of the deepest ties between human beings on the largest scales on this planet, but also the source of some of the deepest divisions between one religion and the next. And so one way to think of what is happening at this turning point in history is the Baha'i community and the Baha'i message is attempting to bridge that gulf, which has previously been completely unbridgeable. The gulf in theological conceptions, the gulf in cultures, the gulf in social teaching has been such that the religions of the world have at most been able to sit on a stage together, smile, say some prayers. That's as deep as religious unity can really get with our current conception of religion. We can think of our mission in the world as revolutionizing this concept of religion to enable humanity for the first time to overcome these vast differences and to become for the first time a single organic thing. And so where we're going collectively then, you can think of it as establishing a community, a vibrant community, but that vibrant community that we're establishing is stage by stage going to be looking more and more outward. It's going to be looking more and more into the world and see itself not as one community among many, implicitly in a kind of competition for numbers, a competition for influence, but rather to see itself increasingly not as separate from the world around it. This seems to me to be, as I read it, as just an individual, in my first impressions of reading the 30th of December message on the 9-year plan, that seems to me to be the direction that it's going. And it's a very exciting direction. As the House of Justice states, the central goal of this plan is the release of the society-building power of the faith in ever greater measures. And it says we should be building vibrant, outward-looking communities. More generally, the language of the plan seems to be nudging us out of this comfortable view, which it had started to do already in previous years and plans, but it's coming into the foreground with this plan, is the idea of really interrogating ever more deeply the idea of the Baha'i community as something that has a really clearly defined inside and outside, which is how all the past religions have defined themselves. To reiterate the statement of the House of Justice from a few years ago, Baha'u'lláh didn't come to bring one more religion to stand alongside this existing multiplicity of sectarian organizations, but has recast the conception, the very conception of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness, which so perfectly, I think, states this narrative of consciousness in the circle of existence that I've tried to outline and make coherent over the last few days. So we can think then of the evolution of the plans in general, really from the time of the Guardian up until the present, to try to an attempt to step back and ask, what's going on in all these plans? There's so many details, there's so much administrativa, there's so much at the level of detail. Can we get any insight from trying to extract from it what's going on at sort of the broadest level? And we could say, one attempt at doing so is to say that these plans are an iterative working out of the answer to the basic questions: who, where, and what. The when and the why are already answered. The when is now, and the why is to transform society, to demonstrate the society changing and society transforming power of these teachings. But one way to look at the evolution of the plans is in terms of how first of all, the question of who are the main protagonists in these plans. Secondly, what is the main geographic unit that's the main sort of area of focus of the plan, the main sort of where is most of the activity taking place, at what scale physically. And thirdly, what is the thing being delivered in the plans? And if we look at each of these three, I think we may come up with an interesting insight from this. Looking first at who, the original plans during the time of the Guardian were very much focused on activating individuals, pioneers, traveling teachers, scattering the seeds as widely as possible. And opening a country meant, at that time, a single person goes there. The Knights of Baha'u'lláh are all mostly were, but are a result of that era of expansion, in which the individual was like the main locus of activity almost. But as the Baha'i community grew and developed into the 70s and 80s, the focus was more on the local spiritual settlement, the localities, developing, thriving local spiritual assembly. But then the protagonist of the plan, into this comes the idea of community as a separate kind of protagonist, alongside individuals and institutions. And this emerges more in the context of the recent plans, talking about community, particularly at a village level, and in rural places all around the world, but also in urban areas. Until now, it's part of our conceptual framework to talk about these three protagonists. But one can see this as something that's evolved over many decades of evolution of these plans, to finally understand what are all the sort of pieces on the chessboard that we need to get moving and that we need to get acting coherently in order to attain our goal. Likewise with the where, at first, it was the target, geography of the early plans was countries. Open the country. There's a single Baha'i in this country. Get someone there. And that progresses again to localities, and then the idea of a cluster emerges on the scene in the mid-late 1990s. And then neighborhoods, and now nuclei. So we can think of these various terms that we've heard over the last few decades as sort of iteratively working out what is the ideal geographical unit to be thinking about and talking about our collective activities as a community. And then finally, the what. Initially, during the time of the Guardian, what is it that was being delivered? It was scattered literature. It was pamphlets translated on the fly in hundreds of different languages. It was nothing systematic. But now we have a systematic way of delivering what, which is through the courses of the Training Institute. And when we look at each of these three, the who, the where, and the what, in each of these, 1996 marked a major turn in the thinking of each. It was a really epochal turn in the execution of these divine plans. And what we're seeing now is in the further evolution of these plans is now that the framework is in place, we're starting to allow ourselves to ask more, how can this framework be varied within the particular needs and requirements of localities? How can we start? And the framework is we understand the main components, so that's not going to change, but how can we change things to adapt to local circumstances? And here really learning and iteration is the keynote of the whole process, learning how to contribute to the discourses that influence the direction of that process. In one of in paragraph 10 of the message, it says different settings and circumstances lend themselves to different approaches. And the friends should be occupied in an ongoing process of learning about what is most effective in the place where they are. And finally, the mobilization of a sizable number of Baha'is who are creatively and intelligently applying the plan's framework for action to the reality of their own circumstances. So if we read these realities which exist at the local level, to what extent might it impact the contents of the meaningful conversations that we want to have with others on a day-by-day basis? To what extent does it impact how we might contribute and participate in the discourses of society? And here's where what I want to suggest is that pretty much all of the content of the last several days of talks have been suggesting new and complementary perspectives, which may, depending on one's audience, be a better way at opening a door for people to go through. Not everyone will be, as I quoted from a great letter from The Guardian a few days ago, some people will be attracted by one sentence, and that same sentence will repel others. That's a bad paraphrase. But the same idea can't be identically attractive to all people, the same wording. Indeed, we know that these teachings are not a single monolithic set of dogmas or doctrines, but represent something much more like a sphere, that we can see one hemisphere of that sphere at any given moment. But in doing so, the other side of that sphere is not visible to us. And can that be a helpful way of thinking about how we introduce these dynamic principles into the world? In some cultures and some localities, maybe it requires a turning of that sphere and an introduction of these basic principles in ways which may seem completely opposite in a way. You're coming at it from a different direction, but the end goal is going to be the same. So for example, I'll just give a number of examples from the last few days. When we talk about God, do we talk about God as a being out there somewhere whose existence can be logically proven? Or do we talk about a God beyond being, existence, and oneness, a reality beyond names and attributes? When we talk about God's action in the world, do we talk about God acting by intervening, by sending down divine revelation, sending down a book, by miracles? Or do we talk about God's action in the world as being what others would simply call nature, being the same as that which the scientist studies, as Bahá'u'lláh said in his Tablet of Wisdom? And introducing all of these pairs, I'm not saying forget one now and go with the other. It's a matter of knowing what the audience is. Some audiences may be far more attracted by seeing it from this angle than from the other angle. So it's a matter of just reading the reality that's in front of us. When we talk about revelation, do we talk about something revealed by a prophet through an act of divine revelation, say every millennium or so, resulting in a book? Or do we talk about something that has been here 1,000,000 years ago, that light was still shining, Bahá'u'lláh says in Promulgation of Universal Peace, that emerges with and catalyzes the development of all life on earth, this principal force impelling the development of consciousness, in the words of the House of Justice. When we talk about spirit, do we talk about matter and spirit being two kinds of stuff, as though the spiritual world were some invisible counterpart to this physical world, with angels floating out in space doing their own angelic things? Or do we think about matter as that which tends towards disintegration, and spirit as that which tends towards integration and process? Something which is more perspectively defined than something which is substantially or metaphysically defined. As Bahá'u'lláh said, progress is the expression of spirit in the world of matter. When we talk about religion, we talk about religion as a package that's been delivered, a system of knowledge and practice, kind of like science, but let's say alongside it, complementary to it, in addition to it. Or do we think about it not side by side, but more vertically? That religion is that which elevates human relationships through the power of love. It's an attitude of the soul that takes a black and white world of atoms in the void and turns on the color. Bahá'u'lláh said, people think religion is confined in an edifice to be worshipped at an altar. In reality, it is an attitude toward divinity, which is reflected through life. Of course, it's much more than that. It's not just that. But it's a matter of what is one's focus when one first engages in a conversation about what religion is. What about the laws of religion? Is it that God revealed it in a book and our job is just to follow it? Or are the laws of religion an expression of the essential relationships proceeding from the realities of things? Do we talk about it in top-down language, or do we talk about it in ground-up, organic language? Again, depending on the audience, either one of these might be the right way to do it. When we talk about our social teachings in general, do they act as an anchor weighing down past religions until they need renewal? Constantly dragging in the face of the progress of society? Or our social teachings, can they be dynamic and evolutionary into the future under the guidance of the House of Justice? As Shoghi Effendi said, prophetically, the machinery of the cause has been so fashioned that whatever is deemed necessary to incorporate into it in order to keep it in the forefront of all progressive movements can, according to the revisions made by Baha'u'lláh, be safely embodied therein. And finally, when we talk about the covenant, do we think of it as we're guided by a source of final knowledge of reality, a set of dogmatic certainties to which we still have continual access? Or do we think of the ground truth of things as something that we never have access to? We are on a ship at sea, and the contours of the ocean floor, ground reality, below us are forever unknown. But we have a mariner to guide us across those seas. The holy mariner who launches the ark, the crimson ark, upon which we are the occupants. And this gets at our overall posture of, are we a community in possession of the final truth on anything? Is that our mission in the world, to deliver the final truth? Or is it something else? Is it to deliver the idea of religious truth being relative? As Shoghi Effendi said, one of the essential verities of the faith is that religious truth is relative. So are we instead delivering hope, delivering a new way of thinking about our collective spiritual history and our collective spiritual future, which is multifaceted, which acknowledges and embraces all of its different colorful manifestations across infinite human minds over history. Guided, of course, in the end, and made coherent by the idea of we're riding in the ark, and we have a mariner, we have a captain, but the contours of that ocean forever below us. So we're not in touch with that ultimate truth of things. But that doesn't keep us from acting together and getting to the other side of the ocean without running aground. So those are all the comments I prepared for today, because I wanted to really open it up for conversation and questions on any topic from the last 5 days. I see that what occurs to me is that Bahá'u'lláh has taken an old form, an old structure, and poured new meanings into it. The Seven Valleys is based on a Sufi work of literature, 800 years prior to Baha'u'llah's revelation, and read merely as a manual for spiritual transformation, personal spiritual transformation. There's no reason why Baha'u'llah should have to re-reveal it, because so much of the content is the same. And indeed, later in his ministry, as we had discussed in a quotation from a tablet, Baha'u'llah said regarding the Seven Valleys, it was revealed to someone of Sunni persuasion in accordance with their thoughts and conceptions, almost suggesting that the whole framework could almost be dispensed with if you only recognize this revelation. So then the question is, what was Baha'u'llah doing in the Seven Valleys? It wasn't just repeating something that was said before. He had new ideas he wanted to convey. And I can think of two of those off the top of my head. One of them, as is the case with many of his writings from before the Declaration, was that it's a kind of a preview, not a preview, but it's anticipating his own declaration. So in many ways, he would say things that if the hearing ear were there, they would hear what Baha'u'llah was really saying. That here's a new infusion of divine revelation in the world. But I think more profoundly, what Baha'u'llah was doing was not so much mapping out for us individual stages in the spiritual journey, but revealing to us the contours of different spiritual types and validating the experiences of each. In other words, it becomes a part of Baha'u'llah's social program, part of the remedy for the world, to introduce to us the idea that maybe people whose religious notions are very different from ours may nevertheless also be true and correct within their own perspective. Yeah. And he does this even more explicitly in the Seven Valleys, which is not even structured as a series of stages.
Four valleys.
Sorry, yes, the four valleys. In the four valleys, which is not structured as a series of stages like the Seven Valleys is, but rather is a description of four different kinds of spiritual seekers. Those who see the world through the lens of the self, through the intellect, through love, and through what he calls the throne of the inmost heart. And so a more direct answer to your question, I think that these divisions in the Seven Valleys and in the Four Valleys and in these other mystical works could also be seen as, in historical perspective, as validating our sort of collective religious history, which has also evolved through different periods and different kinds of understanding. But to take the extreme view and say the Seven Valleys is only a text for social transformation, I think would also be to ignore the fact that divine revelation is something which has layers of meaning. And one of the layers of meaning remains that it is it does have this very personal mystical dimension to it. At the same time, one can, I think, read out these other meanings which are more social in scope. And I'll just add one more thing, and that is that Baha'u'llah's own division of the Seven Valleys into the first three and the last four, the valleys of distinction and the valleys of unity, also seem to me to recapitulate the sort of the division in the scientific mindset versus the more intuitive religious mindset. The scientific mindset is about analyzing, breaking into the pieces, understanding things as a bunch of parts that are working together like a machine, whereas the intuitive mindset, the spiritual mindset, tends to see things more through the perspective of unity. So all of these metaphors are powerful ways of representing a particular view of the relationship of the individual to society. So the mechanical metaphor, for example, it's very programmed. If you're a cog in the machine, then you do your job and that's all you do. And that's clearly not, obviously, the Baha'i view of the relationship of the two. The metaphor that one finds in the Baha'i writings is much more of an organic metaphor of the individual either being like cells in a body or being like, members, the fingers, the eye, the ears, and so forth. And that has the virtue of being a little bit less regimented, and of certainly giving more latitude to sort of individual having different functions, being very different from other individuals, and that's fine because that's part of the whole working of the whole system. But I wonder if even that metaphor goes far enough to capture the Baha'i view of the consequences of this present day of the maturity of the human race. There's a letter of the House of Justice from the 1970s, which I think we were talking about yesterday, about gray areas, where the House of Justice said there's always been gray areas in the past, in the law of God, between what you can and can't do. And that it has been a tendency, a human tendency, to want to fill in all these areas so that everything that you can and can't do is very clearly defined. And the House of Justice makes, I think, a crucial point in that letter, that this day, being the day of the maturity of the human race, one of the consequences of that maturity is that individuals in this dispensation have a greater latitude than they might have had in the past, greater freedom to decide what to do individually in response to what otherwise might be unclear instructions. And that brings me to my favorite metaphor, the direct answer to your question, which is that of music. You can think of our goal as a community to produce the most beautiful music, of beautiful harmonies, of different instruments playing. Sometimes there's silence, sometimes they're playing, sometimes they're all together, sometimes you have solos, you have percussion, woodwind, all of this great stuff, as you have in a symphony. But I don't think the symphony is the right metaphor, because the individual players in a symphony are playing the music they're given exactly as written. Otherwise, you have a cacophony. I think it's more like a jazz band. And yeah, there's a beat, and there's a chord, and there are chord progressions. There's an overall framework. Let's call it a framework for action. Let's call it a conceptual framework. That's the beat, and that says, these are the chords we're playing. But within that, there's infinite potential for individuals to do amazing stuff according to their own individuality. Totally off the top of my head, I would say that, first of all, Baha'u'lláh does not regard his own faith as separate from Christianity, but continuous with it. And in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, he says this is the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future. So that's kind of like rock bottom, but fundamental. And the second half is, well, what makes it changeless when just about component by component you can say it's all different? You have a different prophet, you have a different book, it's written in a different language, you have different laws of marriage and who you can and can't marry, and all of these things. And that's where I would say the second half of it is all of the what most people think of as religion is really for Baha'is a sort of incidental structures that fulfill a particular pragmatic function for a particular point in time. They build up communities, and that's their function. And then this gets to the core of the answer, which is that the changeless part. If you can set aside all of the ultimately external and ephemeral to Baha'is differences, the thing that remains, there's one thing that remains, and as Baha'u'lláh said, all of the laws and ordinances change from age to age, except for the law of love. which, like a fountain, is ever renewed and is constantly flowing. And that's exactly the message of Christianity, that God is love, that we should love our neighbors. It's an identical religion from that perspective. And I guess I would just add to that the message of Christian love is also truly universal and does include all of humanity. But for historical purposes, Christianity is, the way it has evolved, unable to bridge the differences between other religions. Its theology has crystallized too much for it to be able to embrace fully Islam, and even beyond that, because Islam is a sister religion, very similar theological framework, but to be able to embrace Buddhism and Hinduism are so foreign to the Christian mindset that it really requires an entirely new meta structure, which we can say is found in the Baha'i faith. But all of that is still speaking on a kind of intellectual level, because for so many Christians, the heart of their faith is a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And what are Baha'is to say to this? And here is, I think, where we have to make the case that our relationship with Baha'u'lláh and our love for Baha'u'lláh is the same thing re-expressed 2,000 years later. It's the same, as Baha'u'lláh explains in the Kitab-i-Gan, it's the same dynamic of God coming into the world, of the prophet's suffering, of the sort of the return of all of these things from age to age. And for Baha'is, that Baha'u'lláh truly represents that spirit of Christ with which one can have a personal relationship. Abdul-Baha gives us the beautiful imagery of the sun that sets at different points on the horizon at different times of the year, and that the peoples of the world have become fixed and very attached to the particular rising and setting point of their own prophet. And for Baha'is, we look at the light and not the point on the horizon that it sets, which is the historical context of the time and the place. But if you focus on the light that is shining, and the light of Baha'u'lláh shining is that same light of infinite love, then one can recognize that same sun that is simply set on a different point on the horizon. All I can do is share my own speculation, pure speculation on this, which is that this fourth valley of the four valleys, this Arsh-e-Fa, this throne of the inmost heart, has been, first of all, I would say read Gate of the Heart by Dr. Saidi, which has a huge amount of material about this concept of inmost heart, which initially we might think, oh, this is just, me, and I look deeply enough inside of me, I'm going to find this throne and the divine spark and all of that. But my own sense of where this is headed is a little bit more, I guess, let's call it a dangerous spot. And I call it dangerous because we are all very naturally attached to our egos, fundamentally attached to our egos, to the extent that we would really like to believe that, upon our physical passing, everything's pretty much the same, but now we're just somehow invisible. Floating free, the same thoughts, the same memories, the same, everything is just, now we're just kind of translated into this invisible dimension. But my suspicion is that it's not that at all, that it's something far, far better than that, but that because words are lacking for it, the imagery that's given to us in the various sacred books of all the different religions, including the Baha'i faith, is necessarily imagery that's tied to our own egos. So, and that can lead us to think about stages in the spiritual journey And so this ascent from the first valley where the self is the center to that next, that highest valley, which is the throne of the inmost heart, is not so much the illumination of the ego, which then is just nicely illuminated at the final stage, but it is the realization all along that the ego or self is a passing illusion. And the throne of the inmost heart that one attains to is one's true inmost self, but it's not the self that we thought it was. It's the self of God. It's the self of the divine spark residing within. It's the self that we talked about yesterday in that mind-bending passage of the Bab, which says that our soul is some mode of the divine self-remembrance. It was also in the seminar. And I use the word dangerous because to talk in these terms can make it seem very cold and impersonal and something that wouldn't be that desirable. I mean, I kind of like myself. I don't like the idea of I don't like the idea of taking Baha'u'lláh at his word when he says the seventh valley is self-annihilation. I'd like to try to interpret that in a way that I get myself out in the end. And it's also dangerous because mystics of the past have taken this idea, I'm God in the end, and turned it into a kind of self-exaltation, which is also not good. Yeah. If, as the Baha'i writings often use this metaphor of the baby in the womb, if you were to try to explain the next world, the world outside, to the baby in the womb, you might end up using words that would make the world outside the womb seem not that attractive to the baby. So you get cold, you get hungry, there's death and war, disease, all these things outside the womb. But trust me, it's a much better place. Trust me, really, once you're out there, you do not want to go back. And what would the baby say? They said, no, let me just stay right here. And I also use the word dangerous because to say everything we know about the spiritual world is a story or a metaphor or a narrative, which I believe is true, could easily or too easily devolve into a kind of, let's say, postmodernist scenario in which not only is there no ground beneath our feet, but there's no mariner to guide us across the sea. That you're left then with just people competing for power and to have their voices heard, and that's the best you can do is hope that something good comes out of that competition. And and I think that's I think one dangerous conclusion that can come out of realizing that all of this stuff, everything above this sort of dotted line, that separates the world of the tangible and measurable and physical from this conceptual world that we've been trying to inhabit over the last few days of arcs and spirits and God and so forth. To say sort of out loud, all of this is a kind of story or a narrative or a metaphor to try to align our actions in this world below in the right way so that we end up going in the right direction. And what is that right direction? It's ultimately back towards the one. The idea of emergence is very popular in certain scientific circles these days. The idea that certain behavior of matter at a large scale is present, which cannot be detected or predicted from the behavior of that matter at a small scale. So a simple example is water. You can take a molecule of H2O and understand a lot about that molecule. But how much of the properties of water could you predict from just one molecule of water? Would you be able to predict wave motion? Would you be able to predict evaporation and condensation and freezing and all of these wonderful properties of water? But we don't say that these properties, the wetness of water, somehow magically appear when you put a bunch of water molecules together. You say they emerge. They were there in potential, somehow in the pattern of physical law that, of which the water molecule is a part. So what I'm suggesting is that spirit emerges from matter in a similar way, that it is potentially there in the sense that the structure of physical law, the structure of the universe is such that put matter together, wait enough time, have the right physical conditions, and life should emerge from that, and consciousness should emerge from that gradually, not as though it were something that's zapped into it at some moment in time, but rather that it is an organic, gradual appearance of it. Okay? So to say that consciousness is emergent would also be to say that it is present at a lower level in what Abdu'l Baha would call the lower kingdoms of existence. So for example, he says the mineral has a mineral spirit, which is the attractive forces that allow it to come together and to exist as a stone, for example. And the vegetable has a vegetable spirit. And what is the vegetable spirit? It's a spirit of growth, which is just a lower expression of the human consciousness, which has this embedded striving for transcendence. Abdu'l Baha says the plant prays potentially. It says, God, oh God, send down rain. So in a way, the plant, in growing towards the sun and spreading its branches and roots and so forth, is doing the same thing, but at a lower level than what human beings do with their higher level of consciousness. I would also say that this perspective in which consciousness and spirit is not confined to human beings, but is spread out throughout all of creation, is a necessary component of our worldview going forward, because we have to understand our relationship to the environment, not just as this relationship of something that's exploiting it, but something that's one with it, something that has a responsibility for it, as something which is also endowed with spirit in its own way. I did mention panpsychism the other day as an old idea, which has in recent years come back as a very trendy idea in philosophical circles. I mean, professional philosophers are talking about panpsychism now, and it's okay to talk about it now. But I don't want to identify these views of the Baha'i faith with panpsychism. Just because panpsychism it's an evolving intellectual field that might have specific ideas which don't accord to these ideas in the Baha'i writings about the pervasiveness of spirit. But I did want to point out the resemblance, and I think there is a strong resemblance. There's a tablet of Baha'u'lláh which deals directly with this question. It's in Tablets of Baha'u'lláh revealed after the Kitab al-Aqdas. But unfortunately, it doesn't help us. In the answer, Baha'u'lláh says, if you were to assert that the universe always existed, then that would be true. And if you were to assert the same thing as is said in the sacred scriptures, that the universe came to being from nothing, like in the book of Genesis, he said, that is also true. So Baha'u'lláh affirms the truth of both of these, which may not seem to help us that much. But I think when Richard Dawkins said, yes, the universe can come into being from nothing, but it has to be a very special kind of nothing, is actually quite correct, in the sense that the best understanding of cosmology today is that the Big Bang did, well, I can't say with the best understanding. There is really no theory that goes back to the moment of the Big Bang or before. And even if you were to, although the theories of the Big Bang, the theory of the Big Bang does not really say anything about what happened before, if there was a before. Even if one takes the position that the Big Bang was the beginning of it all, that still leaves open the question of what gave rise to the structure of the physical law within which the Big Bang comes into existence. And that's the special something before the nothing that Dawkins was talking about. So this question raises a really fascinating problem, which is how did, apart from the existence of the universe itself, which let's say we can explain using the Big Bang, how do we explain the structure of physical law? That there's 3 dimensions of space, 1 dimension of time, there are these fundamental particles with these masses, there are these forces with these strengths and coupling constants and so forth. All of this seems to be like a very elaborate, fine-tuned structure. And people of a spiritual bent of mind might say, perfect. I've identified the fingerprint of the Creator, because we need to have this special fine-tuning in order to bring the universe into being. We've identified the God has given himself up by showing us the fine-tuning that's behind the universe. Yeah. But the cosmologists are having none of this because they don't want to be able to, they don't want the end point of all this cosmology to be, and God created the world in just such a manner. That would be a very, it would be surrender to a whole group of people they would rather not surrender to. So they've come up with something called the multiverse. And the multiverse takes the idea of the universe and it extends it out into infinity. It says, actually, you don't have to explain why this universe seems to be so fine-tuned, because there's an infinite number of universes out there with all possible values of the coupling constants, with all possible dimensions of space and of time, with all possible forces and particles and all of that. And we just happen to live in this universe which allows life and consciousness to evolve. But in coming up with this idea of the multiverse to escape the seemingly unpalatable conclusion of theistic creation, the cosmologists may have stumbled upon a deeper and even more beautiful explanation for things. And this, the idea behind it is attributed to Plotinus, who was a Greek philosopher in the late Roman Empire. And it's the idea of plenitude. That is, that the one, what the Greeks called God, is infinitely generous with its light. It emanates, just the idea of emanation, the same with the Bahá'í writings, it emanates light profusely with all possible colors, all possible intensities, all possible combinations. Because if it didn't, then you would have to ask, well, why is it only emanating in this way but not in this way? So it has to emanate all possibilities simultaneously. And the Bahá'í writings repeat that idea of the Neoplatonists, the idea of plenitude, the idea of this infinite creative, generative capacity of the primal will, the infinite emanation of things, which can be seen to produce worlds of which we can know nothing, all of the other possible worlds. So it's like the idea of the planet, this multiverse of the modern cosmologists, but translated very identically into this idea of the plenitude of the Greek Neoplatonists. Yeah. This idea of plenitude has been extended mathematically by the MIT physicist Max Tegmark, who's written a book called The Mathematical Universe, which takes this idea of plenitude and extends it to all mathematical possibilities. And his key idea is, what does it mean to exist anyway? So let's just say that all self-consistent mathematical structures exist. and then everything else follows from that. I should also add that while I find this idea compelling and can find evidence for it in the Baha'i writing, it also means the end of science, as we know, because there's no longer this quest for what the ultimate structure of things is now becomes very arbitrary, because whatever the laws of our universe are, it's not that they couldn't have been otherwise, because there's an infinite number of other universes out there with other physical laws. So the quest of physics to come up with that simple, inevitable set of physical laws ends up having to be abandoned. And instead, we live in a very complicated, seemingly designed universe, which really, it's just something, a version of the anthropic principle, which explains why we're here and why the structure of physical law is what it is. Well, it explains this universe as it is already pretty well. I mean, it doesn't explain life or consciousness or the beginning of things. So three admittedly important questions are not well explained. And the beginning, the Big Bang can be traced back to a certain point in time, but beyond that, the other equations break down. So if you bracket those out as really being unimportant, then we have a pretty good model. I assume your question is, will we at some point in the future understand spirit, say, in physical terms? Or will these things that are currently mysteries like life and consciousness ultimately become subsumed underneath a scientific framework? And I don't know the answer to that, but using this picture of the circle of existence and looking backwards in time, things that at a previous stage in our evolution we regarded as mysterious actions of the gods, earthquakes, lightning, coming of the seasons, the harvest, all of these things. Gods were attached to all of these things. Now we understand them as physical phenomena. So why couldn't it be the case that in the future, things that now we say, oh, that's a spiritual thing, consciousness, that's a spiritual thing. It isn't outside the realm of possibility that the advance of knowledge will eventually embrace things that currently we call spiritual. But again, using this metaphor of the circle of existence, there's always going to be something in front of us that we don't understand. And there's always going to be a whole world behind us that we figured out. And how that all divides out is, by definition, what is spiritual and what is material. So there's always going to be a spiritual world. There's always going to be something that human consciousness trends towards, which is ultimately a mystery. So that's a great point. What if we look at this from the other direction? If we just spiritualize the scientific method, can we be led to understanding spiritual realities within a framework of like a spiritualized science? And this is where I guess we could ask specifically, what would be the added procedure or content to the scientific method that would be there in a spiritualized version of scientists doing their science, that's not there in the present day version of, let's say, materialist sciences doing their science? Is the scientific method, could the scientific method be improved upon to say, include, and I'm repeating what I've heard many Baha'is say, to include consideration of spiritual phenomena within the scientific framework? Viewed from another angle, if science got spiritualized, then would the scientific method, could it be changed in some discrete ways that would allow spiritual phenomena to now come into the orbit of material things? Okay, so my answer to that would be, there's certainly a danger in that, and we've seen historically the danger of trying to take revealed word, which was taken as a source of truth in a little t sense, fact about the physical universe, and to try to press science into the service of those of those divinely revealed verses. And we see this in, say, fights over evolution and creationism and so forth in the classrooms. And so at first I would say this is we're treading on dangerous sort of territory to think that we could do such a thing. So my first point is pointing out the danger of that we've seen in the past. And the second would be that it's unclear to me how you would extend the scientific method to cover spiritual phenomena, given that kind of behind that thought is the idea that spiritual phenomena may be something invisible, but as yet ignored by science. And if we could just sort of allow ourselves to measure these invisible things, then maybe we're going to realize that our equations need to be changed in some way. But I'll take a different angle on that and suggest, in line with what I've been saying over the last few days, that maybe spirit is not some invisible substance with its own network, with its own sort of causal network of causal relationships. If spirit is something that emerges, it's an emergent phenomenon, just like entropy emerges from behavior of matter over time, then we are actually studying spirit already. The science of biology, the science of psychology, all of the human sciences are by definition spiritual sciences, because we're analyzing and discussing the effect of spirit in the world. We've just, in our minds, our definition of what spirit is may be different than the Cartesian. But I would just add to that one of the points that was raised a couple of days ago and also in the seminars is that there is a interconnectedness of all things that leads to there being almost a correspondence principle between physical and spiritual realities. So if we understand something in the physical world really well, we might find, there's a parallel to this in spiritual reality. And I think this idea of correspondence opens a potential doorway to people in the physical sciences, say, or the biological sciences or chemistry or whatever, who are deeply informed by these spiritual principles, to be able to come away with something which may actually be usefully applied in the physical sciences. But I don't imagine that it's in a matter of discovering a fifth force kind of thing.